it wasn't just about when I broke my neck. It was kind of the series of events over many years. And it's only in hindsight when we look at the crisis that we can see the clarity of its mission.
When you think about that, like high performance that was in you, sounds like from a very young age, um, and having, it's interesting to kind of ask you these questions because I know how much work you've done, how much self-reflection you've done. So, I'm sure you've really, thought a lot of this through,
Mhm.
um, or seen it or worked on it. Talk to me a little bit about kind of where that comes from, like how you reconcile that energy.
Mm.
You mentioned your parents split, but how much of this do you like see as who you were, or who you are, your essence? How much of it was conditioning from either your parents or the Texas, piece or whatever else? Like what was underneath deep down that like high performance?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a fabulous question. And maybe why I wanted to unpack the history. Well, you invited me to, and most people don't invite to start from the doorway,
Mhm.
so to speak, of life. And perhaps that's why I wanted to unpack it a little bit, because
Mhm.
it's only now in retrospect, after doing a fair bit of work in this space in the medicine arena, I wouldn't know my life without the medicine path. Let's just say that for sure.
Mhm.
And prior to the medicine path, there was another entry into deep self-reflection, which was a pretty significant crisis. So let me uh, go forward in the timeline just a little bit, and then
Sure.
come back to what you're talking about, because it'll give us greater context.
Yeah. Great.
So I was good enough in soccer to go to college, and that was fabulous. But I was not good enough to go pro, and I knew that. And I was also not wanting to get a job in construction or manual labor. I had done those jobs in the summers of high school and college, and it was great because it just gave my mind a break and my body stayed in shape. But I knew I wanted to exercise my mind, and I knew I didn't want a desk jockey job. So I majored in chemistry because it was the only thing in high school that was kind of interesting. And then I had three choices. It was like PhD chemistry track, pharmaceutical chemistry track, or medical chemistry track. And going into uh, like the preparation to go into medical school and then to become a physician. And that was not on my radar. I just happened to go to a school that had a good pre-med program. And so when that was suggested to me by my advisor halfway through my program, I said, "Sure, let me check that out," because I had started getting concussions probably in late elementary school, mostly through soccer, but then eventually through skateboarding and snowboarding and just being a knucklehead. Um, and so when that was suggested to me, I thought, okay, great. I know ER medicine really well. I've been in and out of the ER most of my childhood and adolescence. So let me check that out. So I started doing rotation, volunteership, while I was in college, and it felt at the time like it fit like a glove. It's interventional medicine. You go in for a performer who's athletic and smart. Like surgery or ER medicine is usually the track. And the more I got into it, the more I loved it. And I was going that route. Ended up matching in medical school where I grew up in San Antonio. I went to college in Austin and matched in medical school back in San Antonio. And then the summer between college and med school, when I had a little bit of time, I was traveling a little bit. I grew up fishing also in the Gulf of Mexico. And there was just some wild experience that I can still only describe as serendipity that caused me to jump off a pier head first, just totally sober. And I had fished in that area before, so I like psychologically I knew how shallow it was, and yet I still chose to jump off a pier head first with my hands behind my neck, which I've never even dove in a pool like that. And it ended up being in knee-high water.
Mm.
And so the first thing that hit was my crown. I broke my neck 2 weeks before medical school, and had the option to sit out the year, but I wanted to start anyway. So I ended up starting medical school in this big halo, where they screw your, skull.
I remember,
Yeah, got it. So
yeah.
what
There
that
was a
did,
basketball player at Ohio State who was the first person I ever saw wear one of those. His name was Jay Burson. People from Columbus would remember it, and it was like it looks so serious. It's like, oh my gosh,
yeah.
it's wild. That's amazing. Yeah, I've never actually talked to anybody who's had one.
Mhm.
That's like I could ask you a million questions just about that.
Hey, yeah, we could go down that rabbit
Yeah.
hole. But the reason that I brought the storyline forward just a little bit further is because it's become clear for me that that crisis was meant to happen. And whatever our spiritual and philosophical and religious beliefs are about who orchestrated that, how that was orchestrated, la la la, that's another deep rabbit hole. But I'm 1000% convinced that it needed to happen because it sent me in a very different trajectory in my life. That was a cardinal event where I was going one very particular way, and then that happened and I went a very different particular way. And what ended up happening is, because I was in a halo for 3 months, it finally slowed me down. It gave me a lot of time for self-reflection, which I'd never really taken. And I realized I was living other people's expectations. And now it comes back to the nature of your question. So for high performers, especially if we're groomed as high performers very young, like in childhood and adolescence, whose expectations are we living up to? Whose goals are we trying to meet? And at that time, it makes sense we would be meeting other people's goals because we really don't even have a sense of what our goals are. We really haven't even solidified our ego structure until we're, starting to do that more in early and middle adolescence. But then that still continues to early and middle adulthood. So it makes sense that we would be adopting the expectancies of our environment. But that was one of those times where it became really radically clear for me that I'd been standing on the gas pedal and I had been trying to live everybody else's desire of success for me to make them feel better, particularly my parents, and to make me feel worthy of their love. So I'm not internalizing the reason that they split when I'm 1 year old. Maybe it's my fault. That's a common early childhood belief structure, is our thoughts affect the environment and cause everything around us to actually happen. We come to later learn that there is some truth there, but from the child's perspective, everything, particularly bad that happens, is my fault. So if I want to drive performance to fill a void that I have in my own beingness around self-worth, self-validation, a sense of needing to protect others, serve others, be responsible for others' well-being. There's a really good book called The Drama of the Gifted Child by Alice Miller. And when I was later in my psychiatry residency, it was recommended to me, and it just landed like a ton of bricks. A very thin book, but it just knocked me over the head because there was so much depth and wisdom there. So in the halo, I started self-reflecting, realized like I didn't really enjoy, I was quite good in like the performance metrics in high school and college, but I didn't really enjoy it because I was standing on the gas pedal. I was really aggressive, especially on the field. I didn't care if I stepped on you in order to get the ball. And if you were in my way between me and the ball, then you would get stepped on. And that was known as having that level of intensity. That's why I played defense. I was captain of the team, because that level of aggression could be channeled in a functional way. And how else is that similar to young men going to war, young men playing a variety of other combat sports? And if we don't have those channels for our aggression when we're working on all those deep soul level aspects, then it will end up coming out in some other kind of violent way. Violence to ourselves, violence to others, violence in our words or our actions, violence in our self-thoughts, how we speak to ourselves, about ourselves, how we view the world. All of those things need to be metabolized. And we need to find channels for that. We just end up in our culture, because we have a very performance-oriented culture, especially for somebody like me, because I could tell that my performance, when I was functioning well, doing well, performing well, getting all the awards, my parents were lifted up out of their own psychological challenges. So then I started internalizing the fact that the better I am, the more it helps everybody around me feel good. And that feels good. But then it became a responsibility and a weight that I only started to become aware of when I was in the halo. So instead of going ER and surgery, I went psychiatry and neurology. And so, to the point of your question, as a bit of a long kind of prelude to answer that question, I work with a lot of performers now in a variety of different industries. I'm more of a I'm board certified. I have been board certified in the past in psychiatry and neurology. Those certifications, you get certified together. That was a 15-year kind of certification that I've completed when I finished all my medical training. I'm no longer board certified because the kind of medicine that I practice is not really the allopathic style of medicine. I practice a very different style of, maybe we would call that regenerative medicine, transformational medicine, under part of that kind of, you and I were talking about this just before, hardware and software technology, that software technology being psychedelic therapy. And I was getting into psychedelic therapy close to 20 years ago when psychiatry wasn't that interested in it, but now we kind of come back around full circle. So I work with a lot of performers, and I would say 80 to 90% of the performers, whether they're athletes, CEOs of companies, politicians, et cetera, 80 to 90%. And I've asked other coaches, so I'm more of a coach than I am a counselor or a therapist, because I just have more of kind of a strategic interventional kind of style. And I've had the opportunity to ask coaches of other performers this question. And we have all summated our kind of experience to be able to say, yes, consistently, this is what it seems to be. About 80 to 90% of all performers, especially men in our culture, are driving a level of success in order to fill a void that they have within their own psyche and their own souls, in order to prove themselves worthy of love, worthy of connection, worthy of success, worthy of abundance. There's a need to drive success in order to prove and validate our own place of being, so to speak. And that can look like a variety of different things. So the nature of your question, I think, is 1000% accurate. And I'm glad you brought it up, because this is a big deficit in our culture. And then I'll land the plane and turn the talking stick back over to you. I think it's a huge deficit in our culture because we don't have rites of passages and we don't have initiations where children can enter adolescence with a ceremonial initiatory process, adolescence into adulthood, adulthood into elderhood, and then elderhood into the doorway out, just like in the doorway in, conscious conception, all the way to death with dignity. And these different inflection points, initiation points around that life cycle. So without those practices of initiation, we don't have many adults in leadership positions who are functioning from a place of maturity and reciprocity and deep, true service of benefit to the collective. Most leaders, if we look around, especially politicians, at least the way that politics is enacted today, seem to be much more self-serving than truly oriented to the collective. And it's kind of because of the lobby industry and how many political agendas are being bought because of corporate interest, et cetera. And it's a longer conversation, but that's one thing. We don't have a whole lot of adults who are truly invested in the success and well-being of the collective. And we don't have a whole lot of elders in our community who are given the place of wisdom to be able to offer their families, their communities, and the society at whole. We have this like mass movement of putting our elderly into nursing homes where they don't necessarily have the same degree of purpose, and sense of meaning and sense of importance, and the the right place at the table, so to speak, to be able to offer their wisdom. Like
Hmm.
Mead says, we have in our culture, we have a lot of elders, but we don't have a whole lot of elders.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, to all of that, I agree with you. And I don't have the. It makes sense. I'm not sure that I have the knowledge or understanding of the initiation process, and just how important that is. And I do think that we lack it, in um, today's times, in this country at least. But I want to come back to how you've come to understand and know what you just shared. When I think about you taking that jump, that sounds to me like it's like your awakening moment, and I'm actually was curious to even hear, like, when you think back to that moment that you put your hands behind your head, that take this jump. Is there, I'm kind of curious, like, what do you remember about that? And then like, what actually happened? Like, how did it all come into you? How is it this awakening showing up for you? Like, you
Mm,
know what I mean? How did you come to learn what you just shared?
yeah.
What actually happened that allowed for that information to come into you?
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent question. If I was to speak about the cardinal events in the journey of awakening, and by no means do I feel like I'm awakened. So let's be clear about that. I think
Right.
the I think awakening is a process.
Right. It's an
Where
ongoing thing, right?
ongoing, yeah.
Right.
Not a light switch, like Adyashanti says, it's not a light switch that goes on and stays on. It's
Right.
constant practice. It's constant practice. It's constantly giving over, being willing to look in the mirror. And in the medicine space, I would call that the dark mirror because we're looking into our shadow aspects. And so my process in kind of understanding a little bit of what I just shared has three major parts. And I could say that they were all crises of sorts that led me further and further down the rabbit hole. And I very much believe what Barbara Marx Hubbard, who's a heroine of mine, she's no longer on the planet. She transitioned a couple of years back, but beautiful mind, beautiful writer. Barbara Marx Hubbard is fond of saying that crisis precedes transformation every time.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can really feel into that, and this is where it really tests our faith, because it's hard to have faith in the midst of a crisis. That's where all of our, ego is getting annihilated. Uh, and usually not to the point of death, but it certainly feels like it. And so the ego typically wants to put the brakes on any kind of crisis, but the crisis is actually oftentimes that contraction force that's necessary for the birth or the rebirth process to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So I look at the three major crises that kind of led me further down the rabbit hole and eventually into psychedelic therapy. One was breaking my neck. The second was at the end of all so that was at the doorway into my medical training. And then the crisis on the doorway out of my medical training.
Okay.
Went through a divorce, couldn't feel it, was totally emotionally shut down, and made a big prayer in a sweat lodge to try and open up my heart, do something, have some support to open up my heart. And a really good friend and brother in that sweat lodge heard that prayer because I made that prayer out loud. And he said, I think you might be interested in ayahuasca.
Mm-hmm.
This is like close to 20 years ago. I said, I've never heard of that, but you seem reasonable, so let's try it. And then, so that was the second kind of, going through the crucible of that separation, that divorce, initiation, or the initial experience with ayahuasca, and then closing my practice and moving down to the jungle to apprentice with some of the elders in the Shipibo tradition in ayahuasca. And then that kind of led into the second major crisis when I moved back from the jungle and I just couldn't reintegrate into culture because I'd lived at the pace of nature with no shoes and no running water for about a year. And then I came back into a really aggressive culture that we live in and sent me into about a year of a suicidal depression. Mostly it was just kind of like a dark night of the soul experience where I just was trying to find who I was now. I wasn't who I was before, and I wasn't yet who I was going to become. It was a like classic liminal or bardo space. The bardo is like this Buddhist term in the time between lives. That was the second one. And then the third one is, and those are spaced out about 10 years apart. And the third one was also about 10 years after that, after I moved back from the jungle. My older sister, Trudy, committed suicide.
Mm-hmm.
And each of those events had a way of clarifying another path, another part of the path, another deepening of the path. So I wanted to put that into context because when you ask me how I know or have an experience of some of what I shared initially, it wasn't just about when I broke my neck. It was kind of the series of events over many years. And it's only in hindsight when we look at the crisis that we can see the clarity of its mission. Like the crisis itself has a purpose.